Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I know there's a lot going on today. I'm Karen Tokars, longtime member of the faculty here at the law school, the director of the Negotiation and Dispute Resolution Program, the director of the Civil Rights and Mediation Clinic, and the coordinator of the Public Interest Law and Policy Speaker Series. First, many thanks to Daryl Barker, Bill Matthews, Billy Gutierrez, and Jory Jokiby for helping us with our tech and PR. Also many thanks to our university partner, the Wiedenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy, with whom we frequently partner. Today's event is the fourth presentation of this year's Public Interest Law and Policy Speaker Series. This is the 25th year of this speaker series here at the law school, the formal title of which is Access to Justice Series. Each year, this series brings to the university, to the law school and to the university, prominent public interest advocates, authors, lawyers, academics, social scientists, and government officials to challenge us to think hard about the tough, cutting-edge issues of importance to law and justice. As we all know, there's law and there's justice, and not the twain always meets. Like today's presenter, Mark Rank, the Hadley Professor of Social Welfare here at the university. He's at the Brown School and at the Department of Sociology. He's one of the foremost experts on poverty in the country. He's the author of 10 books with 4 still in the pipeline to go, including his most recent book, The Poverty Paradox: Understanding Economic Hardship Amid American Prosperity. Mark will share with us today his thoughts about why poverty and inequality undermine justice in America. As an aside, I might mention that you might be interested in his website, Confronting Poverty, Tools for Understanding Economic Hardship and Risk, which includes a TED Talk with Mark, and it is an amazing resource. And there is no better person to engage in dialogue with Professor Rank than Professor Steve Fazzari, the Lynch Distinguished Professor of Economics. He's the former head of the Wiedenbaum Center, and he was the inaugural chair, and maybe without him we wouldn't have happened, the University Sociology Department. He will raise comments and questions throughout. If we have time at the end, we'll take questions at the end. I would also note that he has a very interesting website, Muddy Water Macro, and it's interesting. So if we have time, we'll take questions from the audience at the end. Unfortunately, we have to conclude around 12:52-ish because I think there's going to be another class in here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rank and Professor Fazzari.
Thanks, Karen, so much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to get the chance to be with you this afternoon and share some thoughts and ideas. And I'm particularly pleased that both Karen and Steve are here, who I think have contributed more than anybody I can think of to the university and to the quality of knowledge and scholarship here. So it's great to be on the docket with them. So I'll start by noting that my sense is that there's been a growing recognition in the United States that widespread poverty and economic insecurity amidst extreme levels of plenty and wealth seem basically wrong and unjust, that there's something wrong about this situation. But I think one of the questions that needs to be addressed here is the question of why. Why is this situation wrong and unjust? Just because it exists doesn't necessarily mean that it's unfair. So that's a topic that I wanted to explore with you today, why poverty and inequality undermine justice in America. And what I want to do during my comments here is to take up 3 basic questions. First, what does the concept of justice mean within an American context? You know, we talk about justice, we talk about social justice in social work, you talk about justice in the law school, but what actually do we mean by this concept of justice within an American context? So I want to talk just a little bit about that. Second, what do we know about the extent and depth of poverty and inequality in the United States? And then third, why do the high levels of poverty and economic inequality that we find in the U.S. undermine the notion of American justice. And I'd argue that answering these three questions is important to providing both an empirical and a moral justification for the concerns and anger that people have been expressing over the past decade or so regarding economic inequality in the United States. So let me begin by talking about several aspects of justice that I think are critical in terms of understanding how it's been interpreted within an American context. And I would make the argument that there are at least four key components that should be considered when we think about justice in America. The first is the idea that there are certain basic rights that all citizens should be entitled to, that a just society ensures this. Some of those fundamental rights are things we're very familiar with, things like voting, trial by jury, freedom of speech, and so on. And the Bill of Rights in the Constitution obviously laid out some of these. A society that does not guarantee such rights to its citizens is viewed as an unjust society. Only in a few cases might the denial of such rights be justified, such as individuals that are incarcerated. But other than that, all citizens should be entitled to these basic rights. If we look back in history, the denial of people's basic rights was the major argument for why the colonies felt that it was their right to declare independence from England. So England was denying the colonists their basic fundamental rights. For example, the notion of taxation without representation. Consequently, in the Declaration of Independence, it argued that because of the denial of certain basic rights, the colonists were justified and had justice on their side in deciding to revolt. The country was therefore, in a sense, created to correct for the injustice that was being done through England's denying the rights of the colonists. And we've seen that this notion of certain inalienable rights belonging to all Americans has continued throughout our history, for example, through various rights movements. So the most blatant of rights being denied was that, of course, of slavery, which led to the abolitionist movement. The women's suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century was premised on correcting the injustice of women being denied the right to vote. Or the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s was premised on the idea that Black Americans were being denied certain basic rights and that was a blatant violation of this concept of justice. Other rights movements have also largely been built on the idea that certain rights were being denied, and therefore the country was in violation of its sense of justice. So the women's movement, gay and lesbian rights movement, persons with disabilities movement, and so on. One right that's been discussed within this justice context, but is much more controversial, is the right that there should be a basic economic floor that no one should fall below. That in a wealthy country, everyone should have a right to a minimum standard of living. Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually introduced this concept with his Economic Bill of Rights in 1944. But as I said, this has had much less traction than some of the other rights movements. So the protection and enforcement of certain fundamental rights is often viewed as a key component of American justice, that every citizen should be entitled to the full protection and enjoyment of those rights. After all, the Pledge of Allegiance ends with the words, liberty and justice for all, not liberty and justice for some. Okay, a second component of justice within the American context has been the strong emphasis upon the importance of equality of opportunity. That a fair or just society provides equality of opportunities to its citizens. That individuals through hard work and effort can achieve success by taking advantage of those opportunities available to them. And certainly, this is one of the key ideas behind the American dream that Steve and I talk about in our class that we teach. Or as President Johnson talked about the meaning of America in his inaugural speech in 1964, and I quote, "Conceived in justice, written in liberty, bound in union, it was meant one day to inspire the hopes of all mankind, and it binds us still. If we keep its terms, we shall flourish. First, justice was the promise that all who made the journey would share in the fruits of the land. In a land of great wealth, families must not live in hopeless poverty. In a land rich in harvest, children just must not go hungry. In a land of healing miracles, neighbors must not suffer and die unattended. In a great land of learning and scholars, young people must be taught to read and write," unquote. So equality of opportunity basically means that all should be entitled at a fair shot at achieving the American dream, and that certain things that enable one to do so, like a good education, should be available to all. And the basic idea is one of a level playing field. What you then do with those opportunities is up to you. So America has never felt that equality of outcome was just, only equality of opportunity. It's therefore a fair and just society that provides for equality of opportunity for all of its citizens. Okay, a third, I think, critical component of how justice has been interpreted in America, and I would argue that this is true in many other places as well, has been the notion of balance. So for example, when somebody works hard and they play by the rules, we often hope that they will receive their just rewards. Or when a crime is committed, justice is seen as being served if the criminal is sentenced to a punishment that fits the nature and the severity of their crime. On the other hand, if an individual commits a crime and is neither apprehended nor punished, the feeling is that an injustice has occurred. So in cases where individuals experience outcomes and consequences that are congruent with their prior actions and behaviors, the world is seen as just. Conversely, in situations where individuals experience outcomes and consequences that are incongruent with their prior actions and behaviors, the world is seen as unjust. And this concept of balance can be visually seen in the symbol of justice that is found from local courtrooms to the United States Capitol, and that of Themis, or Lady Justice. And indeed, upstairs in your library, you have a statue of this very symbol. So here we find a woman, often blindfolded, holding a measuring scale in one hand and a sword in the other hand. And in this image, justice is being portrayed as impartial and beholden to special interests, hence the blindfold. The fact that she's holding scales has a double meaning. The first implies that evidence should be weighed carefully in deciding how justice should be delivered. But they also connote that justice is served by balance. That is, prior actions and future consequences should be in balance and congruent with one another. Furthermore, the sword that's gripped in her right hand represents the strength and authority of justice and acts as a balance to the judgment derived from the scales in her left hand. So a third element of how justice has been interpreted within an American context is that it should reflect this sense of balance. That, for example, an individual's current economic situation should be roughly in balance with their prior actions and behaviors. Okay, the final component of justice that I want to mention that I think is key to thinking about the American context is that of what we might call deservedness. And this idea follows pretty closely from the notion of balance that I just mentioned. Basically, in a just society, what you deserve in life should reflect your prior efforts, actions, and talents. This particular concept of deservedness has often been applied to the poor and those in poverty. So the this criteria has been used over the centuries, particularly since the English Poor Laws of 1601, to divide the poor into the categories of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. The deserving poor are individuals deemed worthy of our compassion and assistance because they find themselves in poverty through little fault of their own. Consequently, an injustice has occurred. Such persons would include those who have had an unavoidable illness or accident, children, widows, and so on. On the other hand, individuals falling into the undeserving poor category are seen as neither meriting our compassion or our assistance. These are often referred to as the able-bodied poor. Such poverty is perceived as being brought about as a result of laziness, immorality, bad decisions, or some other failing, and therefore impoverishment is a just or deserving consequence of prior behavior. So the notion of deservedness, I think, is a fourth component of what I would call the American sense of justice. So these four components that I've been discussing, I think, are essential to understanding what justice means within an American context. A just society ensures that basic rights are entitled to all. It supports the idea of equality of opportunity for all. It strives to make sure that prior actions and behaviors are in balance with current outcomes and consequences, so that in the end, people basically achieve what they deserve in life. Okay, So I think that's a framework for thinking about what do we mean by justice within an American context. Let me turn now to the second topic that I want to discuss, and that is what do we know about the extent of poverty and economic inequality in this country? And what I want to do is first lay out very quickly some information about what we know on this topic, and then I want to discuss why I believe that these conditions undermine the American notion of justice that I've just been talking about. So what do we know about the extent of poverty in the United States? Well, we can think about this in several different ways, and I talk about this in my class. When we talk about how much poverty there is, you can think about this in a number of different ways. The most common way to think about this is to determine how many people experience poverty in a year. That's what the US Census Bureau does. Their report came out a couple of weeks ago and looked at that particular question. So last year, the US poverty rate was 11.5%, which translated into 38 million individuals, or about 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 9 Americans were in poverty last year. For children, 15% of kids under the age of 18 fell below the poverty line. And I should point out that the official measure of poverty is actually a quite conservative measure. So last year, for example, for a family of 3, the poverty line was drawn at around $23,000. So if your household was earning less than that, you'd be considered in poverty. If you made more than that, you would not be counted as officially poor. The other thing I should point out is that 45% of folks that fall below the poverty line fall actually below half of the poverty line. So instead of a family of 3 living below $23,000, that family would be living below an income level of $11,500. So, a quite extreme measure. So that's one way of thinking about poverty, is how many folks are in poverty at a point in time or in a particular year. A second way of thinking about the extent of poverty in the country is what are the lifetime chances of experiencing poverty at some point during your life? And this is a question that I've done a lot of work on in terms of my research. And it turns out that the odds of experiencing poverty at some point for Americans is actually quite high. So 2/3 of Americans can expect to experience at least 1 year below the official poverty line between the ages of 20 and 75. And for African Americans, the percentage is 90%. Children are at a particularly high risk of experiencing poverty. So in one analysis that I did, it showed that 1/2 of all American children at some point during their childhood would reside in a household that used the SNAP program or the food stamp program. And if you're in a household receiving one of those receiving the SNAP program, you're by definition in poverty. So that's a second way of thinking about the extent of poverty in the United States. Rather than thinking about it in terms of how many folks fall into poverty in a particular year, what's the long-term scenario in terms of the likelihood of experiencing poverty? And people often say to me, well, how can those percentages be so high? And the reason is we're talking about a 30 or 40-year period, and over that period of time, unexpected things happen to people, like losing a job, getting sick, a family splitting up, a pandemic happening. All these things have the potential to throw people into poverty, and when those things happen, there's not much of a safety net to protect people. So that's why those percentages are so high. A third way of thinking about the extent of poverty in the United States is to compare ourselves with other countries. Are we high or are we low compared to other sort of industrialized countries? And it turns out that the prevalence and depth of poverty in the United States is basically the highest among the Western industrialized countries. So whether we look at poverty within the working age population, for the elderly, for single-parent families, or for children, the story is basically the same. So for example, in an analysis I did that looked at using OECD data, which is data for the sort of high economy industrialized countries, out of 26 high economy countries, the US had the highest rates of overall poverty and childhood poverty. The 25 country average for childhood poverty was 11.7%, whereas for the United States, it was almost double at 20.9%. So in summarizing kind of the economic condition of children in the United States compared to children in other countries, let me just quote from one particular study that says the following. American children who are in families in the upper 20% of the income distribution are doing exceedingly well. They have much higher standards of living as measured by real spendable income than do similarly situated children in all other countries. If we look at children in the middle 20% of the income distribution, we find again that American children are at the top in terms of their economic standards of living. However, when we look at children at the lower end of the income distribution, here we find a very different picture. These American children wind up being much worse off compared to children in nearly all other industrialized countries. Consequently, while the United States has a higher real standard of living than almost all comparison countries, it is the high and middle income children who reap the benefits, while the average low-income child in America is at least 1/3 worse off than the average low-income child in the other industrialized countries, unquote. So what this body of work tells us is that when we compare poverty among children and adults in the United States with children and adults in other countries, the US has far and away the highest levels of poverty. So that's a third way of thinking about the extent of poverty in the United States. All right, what about income inequality, which is a bit of a different issue than poverty? Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about rising inequality in the United States. I don't need to tell you that. It's often in the news. And the story is, once again, if we compare income inequality in the United States compared to other Western industrialized countries, the US has far and away the highest levels of income inequality. And when we talk about income inequality, you're looking at the distribution of the income, and so you're looking at kind of the separation or the distance between those at the top and those at the middle, and where those at the top and at the bottom, and where those in the middle fall. So, if we look at what's been happening to income inequality over time, during the last 40 or 50 years, the only group that has increased their piece of the income pie has been the top 20% of the population, and particularly the top 5 and the top 1%. These are where almost all of the gains in the US economy have gone over the last 50 years. For the bottom 80% of the population, their economic position has either been static or has actually declined in real terms. So for example, this is data from the latest Census Bureau. The median earnings for men who were working full-time in 1973, once you adjust for inflation and put it into 2022 dollars, was $62,150. Okay, this is men working full-time. By 2022, last year, their median earnings stood at $62,350. So in other words, the typical male worker in the United States has only gained $200 over the last 50 years in terms of their real wages. So this is one way of showing the stagnation that has been happening for so many folks in the population. Another way of sort of thinking about this increasing skewness of income is in the following way. So there's a very famous economist that Steve knows well, and we talk about sometimes in our class, named Paul Samuelson. And he was very famous in a number of ways, but he had a really well-used introductory economics textbook that ran through 11 or 12 editions. Well, in the first edition of that textbook in 1948, he observed that if we made an income pyramid out of children's play blocks, with each layer representing $1,000 of income, the peak in 1948 would be approximately the Eiffel Tower, and most of us at that time would be within a yard or so of the ground. And that would sort of represent the top and the sort of the rest of the population. By the time of Samuelson's 2001 edition of the textbook, most of us still would be within a yard or two of the ground. But now the Eiffel Tower would have to be replaced by Mount Everest to represent the top of the income distribution. And that shows you vividly what's happened over time in terms of the skewness of the income distribution. Or another way of looking at this, and one that you'll often see in the news, is what's happened between the distance between the average worker's salary and the average CEO's salary. So in 1980, the average CEO of a major corporation earned around 42 times that of the average worker's pay. Today, it's well over 300 times. Now, if we focus on patterns of wealth inequality, we see an even more skewed picture. This becomes even more depressing in a way. Today in the United States, we find that the top 1% of the US population currently own nearly half of the entire financial wealth in the country. Financial wealth refers to stocks, bonds, savings, those kinds of assets. The bottom 60% of the population are in possession of less than 1% of the country's entire financial wealth. So again, a very, very skewed picture. What all of this data tells us is that the United States has extremely high rates of both poverty and economic inequality compared to other Western industrialized countries. Okay, so let me get to my third question, which is, so given this situation that I've laid out, what I want to argue is that these economic conditions significantly undermine the earlier notions of justice that I was talking about. And just to recap, those four major components of justice were entitlement and protection of rights, equality of opportunity, balance, and deservedness. So let's begin with the entitlement of fundamental rights. When you have such high levels of poverty and inequality, the basic argument can be made that although everyone may be theoretically entitled to certain fundamental legal rights, the fulfillment of those rights is strongly affected by your economic position. So just to give one example, Derek Bach, who is the former president of Harvard and has written a number of books on these subjects, writes, he says, "Surely there is no other nation where the nature of individual freedom has been elaborated in such detail, or any other society that is so well organized to ensure that essential liberties are defended and preserved. At the same time, freedom in the United States may be more limited by other forces than it is abroad. For example, the government in America often makes less effort than others to make sure that all or most Americans have the means to exercise important rights they fundamentally possess. To choose but one example, it is impressive to grant everyone accused of a serious crime the right to qualified counsel, but the right may not be worth much in practice if the lawyers assigned turn out to have so little time that they can scarcely do more than hastily agree to exchange a guilty plea for a slightly reduced sentence. Yet this is the situation that exists in many jurisdictions in this country," unquote. And I think we could think of many other situations where poverty and economic inequality undermine people's ability to fully partake in their legal rights and freedoms. Or, on the other hand, where having substantial resources allows one to take much greater advantage of those rights. A clear example would be being able to participate in the political process, where you see economics really play themselves out in terms of who's able to exert themselves and who is not able to exert themselves. Consequently, the notion that everyone is fully entitled and equally entitled to certain basic rights in reality falls far short, because those with lower levels of income are not able to fully take advantage of those rights, while those at the higher end of the income distribution are able to exert considerably more influence through those rights. Okay, so that's the first way in the components of justice in which I think poverty and inequality undermine a fundamental component of justice. Let me turn to the second major component, and that is the importance of equality of opportunity that I mentioned. That a just society provides for everybody equality of opportunity. And I'd argue that equality of opportunity is significantly skewed with the presence of large economic differences in the population, as well as large amounts of poverty. And let me just give you two examples to show this. There are many, many others that could be talked about, but let me just give you two: education and health. So first, education. Public education began in the 19th century as a way to ensure that all children would have access to this important tool. That this was viewed as an important avenue to provide for everyone a means of equality of opportunity. Yet in order to compete effectively for economic opportunities today, both the quality and the quantity of education are critical in terms of getting ahead. And on both counts, poverty and lower income status stunt the educational process. So, and one key reason for this is that public education is funded largely through local tax dollars. This is one of the very few countries in which a large part of public education is funded this way. So those who grow up in poor households are likely to be living in lower income areas. And those lower income communities, in turn, are severely limited in the amount of financial resources that they can devote to their school systems, the quality of teachers that they can attract, and so on. And what this results in is a significant reduction in the quality of education that these students receive. And one has only to compare the facilities and the personnel at any inner city public school with those of an affluent public suburban school or a private school to observe this process that I'm describing. Consequently, children in these different socioeconomic settings have greatly different odds in being able to achieve a quality education that would allow them to compete in the labor market. All are American students, yet clearly not all are entitled to a first-rate education. The same process continues in terms of students going on to college and at the university level. So that's one example. A second example of how economics can profoundly impact life chances, and therefore the notion of equality of opportunity, has to do with health. So in order to compete in the labor market, one must have reasonably good health. Yet lower socioeconomic status and poverty have a negative impact on health status. Adults who are poor are more likely to have higher rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and virtually every other major illness and cause of death. Children in poverty are also more likely to suffer from various health ailments, including lead poisoning, asthma, and injury from accidents and violence. In addition, these illnesses and conditions are less likely to be attended through the healthcare system. As a result, health deteriorates, again leading to reduced opportunities. In the end, Americans in the top 5% of the income distribution can expect to live approximately 10 years longer than Americans in the bottom 10% of the income distribution. So what these examples show, and there are many, many others that I could talk about as well, is that the American ideal of equal access to opportunities is undermined by the conditions of poverty and economic inequality. The poor and those at the lower end of the income distribution simply do not have the same chances and opportunities that others in our society do. And to argue that everyone is roughly starting at the same point, the starting line being the same point, and therefore equality of opportunity exists, is just simply wishful thinking. So let me turn now to the fourth and final component of justice that I mentioned. And that is the third and fourth components. That is this notion of balance and the idea of deservedness between current circumstances and prior behavior. So the question here becomes, is poverty and economic destitution deserved and in balance with prior actions? And I would make the argument that in the vast majority of cases, the answer is no. And here's a relatively simple way of seeing this. If we just look at the demographic composition of the poor population, 31% of the poor last year are under the age of 18. And I challenge anyone to make the argument that an 8-year-old child deserves to live in poverty as a result of his or her prior actions. That argument simply cannot be made. An additional 14% of the poor are over the age of 65, a category that we generally feel is deserving of some kind of assistance. A further 17.5% of the poor are between the ages of 18 and 64 and suffer from some kind of significant disability, a significant work disability. So therefore, if you just look at the demographics, we can see that nearly 2/3 of the poverty population fall into categories that most people would argue are not deserving of impoverishment. For the remaining third of the poor, research has shown that much of their poverty is the result of failings at the economic and political level, such as the lack of enough decent paying jobs to support a family. So consequently, the overall conclusion is that for the vast majority of the poor, impoverishment cannot be justified in terms of prior actions and behaviors. And I certainly haven't talked about the other side of this issue, which is that for those on the economic high end of the scale, the notion of justice is also being distorted. For example, to what extent is the great wealth of those on the high end deserved and in balance with prior actions? That's a discussion that could be much longer than what I have time for today. So it's a totally different kind of way of thinking about this. So just to finish up my comments and turn it over to my colleague, Professor Fazzari, I think that one can make a very strong argument that large amounts of economic inequality and poverty really have a distorting and undermining effect on the American sense of justice. That these conditions do indeed undercut our country's overall notion of fairness and justice. They erode the idea that all citizens should have full access and entitlement to certain rights. They damage the principle of equality of opportunity, and they result in conditions that are neither deserved nor in balance with prior actions. And I would argue then that in order for America to really live up to its own standard of justice, alleviating the conditions of poverty and economic inequality should be a top priority as we move ahead in the coming years. So I'll stop there and I'll turn things over to Steve.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I have a little sniffle today, but I did test for COVID this morning, highly negative. I know what a positive looks like, sadly. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here. I want to echo Mark's comments about Karen and what she's done for the university over the years, and Mark has just been a wonderful colleague for me. He referred to the class here. I don't know if he ever really explained this. I think it's relevant to get the context of our interaction. And a couple of our former students are here. It's good to see you guys. I don't know, it's probably about, in fact, I know when it was, about almost 12 years ago, we gave the first iteration of this course called The Economic Realities of the American Dream. And this is a class that really followed up from one of Mark's books, like 5 or 6 behind. I can't keep track of how quickly he turns out the books, but a book about chasing the American dream and the things that shape that important concept over time. And it was really a great opportunity for me to broaden my perspectives as an economist into some of the bigger issues that face society in this sense. And it's been a great experience, and a lot of what the conversation is here is really part of that course, and where some of my comments are going to go in this direction, where I want to just make share some general thoughts about economic inequality in the broad sense and the concept of justice. First, I would say that it's important to recognize that the notion of fairness is just central to our society. Now, I must say that economists tend to shy away from that, and that's a conversation we could have a little bit more about why that's the case and why that's been true. Although I think it's changing. As Mark's pointed out, there has been more attention, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, on the issue of economic inequality, and that is spilling over slowly, in my view, to the economics profession. But fairness, it's kind of central to our society, to what we think of. The example I like to use in talking about this and making this case is just think about little kids. And what do they say all the time? That's not fair. I mean, I have grandchildren now, 11 and 7 years old. That's not fair. You hear it all the time. It's just part of where we are at the very beginning. And I think across life, across experiences, the notion of fairness is clearly very important. I want to comment a bit on that, in that context, on deservedness and balance. As Mark pointed out, these are closely related concept of justice. This idea of you get what you deserve is in some sense a part of balance. And give you another example that comes from our class, and an example that Mark didn't share today, but I think is particularly interesting, which is that he talks about this issue of justice in the sense to the students of, well, what would you think it'd be just if every student got an A? No matter what. And immediately students resonate with it. This is an unusual semester. Mark's on sabbatical, so I'm teaching the class for the first time by myself. But we just talked about this, and I have the students comment on a discussion board on Canvas, and they resonate with this immediately. No, that's not just. They might be much more open to the idea of inequality or of a more just society or things like that. But as soon as you say to them, would it be fair if everybody got an A? They push back against that in a rather significant way. So the point is that this fairness concept seems very deeply ingrained in our society, at the very least, if not in our humanity. And then this ties into this issue of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. So equality of opportunity is strongly supported. We have survey evidence we use in the class. Mark has developed it that shows 90+% of Americans support the idea of equality of opportunity in a survey. but not equality of outcome. The support for that is actually quite limited. The American view is a rather meritocratic view. You deserve what you get, in some sense, to be a little blunt about it. But as Mark pointed out in his lecture, this leads to a tension because outcome conditions opportunity in a fundamental way. And I probably don't need to expand much more on that based on what Mark said all the way. I could use an economics example, which is Milton Friedman. We have our students read a chapter from Free to Choose, trying to balance perspectives from different parts of the ideological spectrum. And Friedman does an excellent job of explaining how price adjustments and things like that lead to an efficient allocation of resources, and it really is quite amazing from the economics point of view about how well the price system works in certain ways. But he also ties it to income distribution, and one of the issues he says is, well, we can't really worry about distribution because it's just a matter of chance. His discussion's a little broader than that, but that's what I want to focus on today. And I think this is deeply misleading, that as Mark points out, the opportunities that we get are heavily conditioned by the social circumstances in which we find ourselves. It's not simply a matter of chance. I used to use this topic way back in the day when I taught introductory microeconomics and said, well, maybe chance in terms of some unknown, unborn human potential, but once you're born and once you're in a particular place on this earth, it's not just a matter of chance. But also, there's a sense in which the pursuit of opportunity is constrained by the market. So I get a little bit of an economics angle on this. And the market determines what the rewards are from hard work and making certain kinds of choices. And I think it's probably fair to say that it's entirely possible to work hard, make pretty good choices, but things don't work out well. One of the most poignant moments in our course, which was some years ago, is when the Fight for 15 group was active and trying to argue for $15 an hour wages for fast food workers in particular, but obviously the implications were much broader than that. And we were able to bring in a few people from that group to talk to our class. And it was stunning what they said. To hear what they were going through, to try to just live the day-to-day life, and this would relate to Mark as a prominent poverty scholar, but taking buses between multiple jobs, car breaks down, you lose your job, working many hours, way more than full-time work, in very difficult circumstances. These people were doing their best, and I remember one fellow in particular saying, all I want to do is be able to support my family in this context, and he couldn't pull it off. The market was not letting him do this. His opportunities were extremely limited. And this relates to Mark's point about the lack of decent paying jobs in the economy. And if we think about this, there have been shifting patterns of production due to globalization and trade, due to changes in technology. And the result is that job opportunities are being torn away from people through clearly no fault of their own. I'm referring a lot to Mark's work here. There's an interesting interview that Mark did with a former worker at the big Chrysler plant, which no longer exists out there on I-44. And it was clear that he faced a lot of difficulties, and his family faced a lot of difficulties when Chrysler pulled out. It wasn't his fault. There's stories about I think it's the General Motors plant, it might be the Lordstown, Ohio plant, but I'm not so sure, when they closed that down and the workers had the option to stay with GM, but that meant going to Indiana to work 4 or 5 hours away from where they were, people that had been established in the community for generations. These are the kinds of things that are very difficult to pursue. I'm looking at the clock and we have to end in like 4 or 5 minutes, so I better move on here. Maybe I'll just finish up with a final observation. What I would view as a contradiction in the American dream perspective or the American ideology or social structure more broadly. There seem to be 2 pillars that relate to the comments Mark made. The first one is justice as being tied to deservedness, some kind of equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. And then there's a second pillar, which is freedom. Mark again talked about this too. I just saw the FDR memorial in Washington, D.C. and was really quite affected by it. So this idea of freedom and justice fitting together is central to the American ideology, the Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all. But inequality of outcome leads to inequality of opportunity. Inequality of outcome prevents true freedom for those in poverty, and I think also constrains well up into the working class and the middle class in some sense. So this justice and freedom concepts just don't fit together in that sense. It's a bit of a contradiction. And I think this challenges the basic concept of the American dream. If I learned one thing from teaching this course, is this idea of how individualistic the concept of the American dream is. You work hard, you play by the rules, you should have a good economic life. But it's just not playing out in that sense. And I think this means that we need to take a different look at how we organize our society, how we set our economic policies, and so I'm really concluding in pretty much the same place that Mark did. So thanks for your comments. I guess we have just a few minutes. Karen, you can run it for questions.
We have a couple minutes for questions we will take. Then I'm going to invite you to either capture them up front or capture them outside just for a couple minutes afterwards, because I know a number of you have questions and it's just going to be impossible to do all this. If you're struck like I am as somebody who's more law trained than economic trained, it's very daunting. I think I know this stuff, and then to hear them just make it even more distinct and vivid is just really heart-wrenching. And I'm curious in a minute, maybe not now, but later. I want to hear from law students and lawyers about how we need to convey this information more to our law students. Because I think when we teach law, the way we teach law, in a somewhat siloed fashion, as if there is this mythical thing called black letter law, it totally ignores the realities of humanity. So, that's my stress. But jump in here first and then second.
I just would like to know, is there any suggestion of what do we do with this information? How do we fix it?
Yeah, I know. That's the question. Should I hand it over to you? You know, I mean, there's lots of things that that we can think about, in terms of reform and things like that. I do think, and this is kind of a simplistic answer, but I do think change can begin on an individual level and on individual discussions and things like that, on a sort of a grassroots level. But yeah, I mean, these are huge issues. This is very, very complex. I think policy, progressive policy can address many of these things. One great example of something that really had a pretty dramatic effect for a short period of time was the refundable child tax credit, which, as part of the pandemic relief, was basically giving families with children a certain amount of monthly cash. A lot of European countries do this kind of thing. And that cut child poverty by like 40%. And it was only in place for about 6 or 7, 8 months, something like that. But that had a dramatic effect, and it hasn't been continued. But, that's an example of something that can be really pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's an important question. Time is short, so I'll just be really brief and say that, really go back to my final point. That in addition to specific policies, and I think they're very important, there's a sense of a need to really maybe rethink what it means to have a successful American society and how it's structured. And I do think that this tension exists, and that's kind of an academic, big think topic. But I don't know that we can really have serious change until we get out of this. Everybody gets what they deserve, and just work hard and play by the rules. And we live in the land of opportunity. Everything will be fine. It's just not true.
Yes, sir.
So I know that the Great Society and the kind of social safety nets that have been created since the 60s have been very criticized by conservatives as being actually enabling poverty or creating dependency. Any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I'll give. So the question is, that in the 1960s there was a real emphasis by Lyndon Johnson and President Kennedy to some extent of a great society of providing a lot of resources and programs to help folks, specifically lower income folks and folks of color as well. So Ronald Reagan was famous for saying, "We fought a war on poverty and poverty won." Okay, that was a famous thing that he said. It actually turns out, if you look at poverty in the United States, in 1959, it was the poverty rate was 22%. By 1973, it was 11%. Was poverty eliminated? No. Was poverty dramatically cut in half? Yes. And the reason was two reasons. One, because of the Great Society programs and social welfare net expanding, and a really robust economy. My argument in a lot of my work is that to a large extent, if you want to understand poverty, it can be seen as a structural failing rather than an individual failing. And that's a key example of it. That's an example of policy and economics reducing poverty. So those programs, I think, and where there's some, some didn't work, some did work, but I think actually they were pretty dramatic. Another thing on I could talk forever on this, on the Great Society programs is it introduced Medicare and Medicaid, which had indexing Social Security to the rate of inflation, which had a dramatic effect on reducing poverty amongst the elderly. If those programs weren't around right now, the poverty rate for the elderly would go from 10% to 40%. And that shows you that those programs have a dramatic effect. Those are some of our most effective anti-poverty programs that we have.
All right, let's try to squeeze in one more. We're gonna make the last minute. Here's some talk.
When you first started, you mentioned that basic rights were entitled to everybody except perhaps those incarcerated. I would argue with that point. I think basic human rights should be for everybody, including those people.
And I think that's a really good, it's a really good observation, but I would say that a lot of folks in the United States view that if you are incarcerated, you are not entitled to those rights. So I just pose that as sort of a caveat. But I would agree with you. I would agree, and especially the issue of when people have already done their time and their rights are not restored.
Because we don't do that, it leads to more poverty in America.
Well, and that's a whole. This is a whole nother topic. Absolutely, absolutely.
Please join me in